I was in my podcast studio when I heard the massive crash of metal meeting wood from outside my ranch. Looking through the window, I saw a silver Toyota Camry backing away from what used to be my chicken coop. Behind the wheel was Janine, the self-appointed HOA enforcer of an organization that doesn't exist, laughing like a maniac. This wasn't an accident. This was revenge. And I, a podcaster who specializes in investigative crime, just got a front row seat to the wildest case I've ever encountered. Clipboard and fake violations weren't enough anymore. Now, she'd escalated to vehicular destruction. What do you think when your neighbor uses their car as a weapon? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, because this story is about to become a real crime documentary. But let me back up. 2 weeks before the crash, when this whole nightmare began, it was 3 a.m. when my security system alerted me to movement on my property. I pulled up the camera feed on my phone and saw something that made me question my sanity. A woman with disheveled bleached hair, wearing a wrinkled blouse and clutching a clipboard like it was some kind of magical authority wand, was creeping across my ranch with a measuring tape. She wasn't just trespassing. She was systematically measuring distances from my barn to the property line in complete darkness. The sight sent chills down my spine. This wasn't some confused neighbor or lost tourist. This was someone who had studied my property, planned this intrusion, and was executing it with the methodical precision of a stalker. I grabbed my intercom microphone with trembling hands and called out, "Ma'am, you're on private property. What are you doing out there?" The woman looked directly into the camera with the kind of smile that belongs in horror movies and held up her clipboard. "I'm conducting an official Hollow Creek Property Standards Board inspection. This property has multiple violations that require immediate documentation." Her voice carried the artificial cheerfulness of someone who had rehearsed this moment, but there was something underneath it, a kind of manic satisfaction that made my skin crawl. I had moved to this 15-acre ranch in Hollow Creek, Texas, just 3 months earlier, specifically to escape the chaos of city life and create a peaceful environment for my true crime podcast, Dark Hollow Mysteries. This place was everything I had dreamed of. The rolling hills, the historic barn from the 1920s that provided perfect acoustics for recording, the charming chicken coop where I could raise my own eggs, and enough space for my 2 border collies, Sherlock and Watson, to run free. It represented safety, independence, and the kind of life I had worked years to achieve. Now, watching this stranger violate that sanctuary in the middle of the night, I felt something precious being torn away from me. She held up a laminated card that looked like it had been created on a home printer, complete with her photo and the title, Community Standards Enforcer. The amateur quality of the fake credentials would have been laughable if the situation weren't so deeply unsettling. When I told her through the intercom that she had no authority on my property, she responded by pulling out what appeared to be official-looking bylaws printed on cardstock and began reading violations in a voice loud enough to wake the neighbors. The violations she cited were so absurd they bordered on comedy. Barn structure exceeds maximum height restrictions by 18 inches, and chicken coop placement violates aesthetic harmony protocols. But what struck me wasn't the ridiculousness of her claims, it was the genuine conviction in her voice. This woman truly believed she had the right to be on my property at 3 a.m, measuring my buildings and issuing citations for crimes that existed only in her imagination. As I watched her methodically document every structure on my property, speaking into what appeared to be a small recording device, I felt a growing sense of dread that had nothing to do with property violations or fake authority. This woman knew my property layout better than some of my guests did. She navigated around obstacles in the darkness without hesitation, suggesting she had been here before, probably multiple times. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I had been under surveillance, studied, analyzed by someone whose motives I couldn't begin to understand. The peaceful ranch that had represented my escape from urban chaos was no longer safe. Worse, I began to doubt my own judgment. Maybe I had missed something during the property purchase. Maybe there really were regulations I didn't know about. The seed of self-doubt that she planted with her confident authority performance began to grow in the fertile soil of 3 a.m. anxiety and sleep deprivation. Non-compliance will result in escalated enforcement actions, she announced, before gathering her materials and walking back to her silver Toyota Camry. The phrase escalated enforcement echoed in my mind long after she disappeared into the darkness. What did that mean? What could someone with no actual authority do to escalate anything? But even as I tried to rationalize her powerlessness, I couldn't shake the feeling that she had just delivered a threat rather than an empty warning. As she drove away, I noticed she didn't leave the area immediately. Instead, she circled my property slowly, as if studying every angle and entrance. The entire encounter lasted nearly 40 minutes, and I had it all recorded in high definition, but somehow I felt like she had won something in this first confrontation. The next morning brought the crushing confirmation that the midnight visit hadn't been some kind of bizarre dream. Every fence post, gate, and visible surface of my property was covered with yellow papers labeled "Violation Notice" in bold red letters. But it wasn't the quantity that disturbed me most. It was the specificity. One notice cited my mailbox for being 7 inches too close to the road, complete with a hand-drawn diagram showing the exact measurement. Another declared my vegetable garden non-compliant with community aesthetic standards due to excessive diversity of plant species. The level of detail suggested hours of surveillance and planning, transforming what should have been my private sanctuary into someone else's obsession. Standing in my driveway that morning, surrounded by dozens of fake violation notices fluttering in the Texas breeze, I realized that my quiet life in Hollow Creek was over. The woman with the clipboard had declared war on my peace of mind, and I had no idea how far she was willing to take it. The violation notices were just the opening salvo in what would become a psychological war of attrition. Instead of random daily harassment, Janine had developed a system that seemed designed to erode my sanity through bureaucratic Chinese water torture. Every Tuesday and Friday, I would wake up to find exactly 3 new citations, each one more personally invasive than the last. She had apparently spent considerable time studying my habits, because the violations targeted things that mattered to me most. When I planted wildflowers near the barn, she cited me for unauthorized native species cultivation. When I installed new lighting for evening podcast sessions, she declared it a light pollution violation affecting neighborhood tranquility. The precision of her attacks suggested she was watching me constantly, learning what brought me joy, then systematically destroying it with her fake authority. What made the harassment truly diabolical was her attempt to turn my neighbors against me through manufactured social pressure. Janine had created something called the Hollow Creek Community Standards Group and was actively spreading rumors that my property was bringing down everyone's home values. She posted professionally formatted announcements about emergency property meetings and community compliance workshops, complete with grainy photos she had taken while trespassing on my property. The posts were written in the kind of bureaucratic language that made her sound like a legitimate authority figure rather than a delusional stalker. Recent non-compliance issues have been documented at the Cole property, read one post, requiring immediate community intervention to protect our neighborhood's integrity and property values. The implication was clear. I was the problem neighbor that everyone needed to unite against. The social isolation began subtly, but quickly escalated to something that felt like being quarantined by my own community. Mrs. Henderson, who had brought me homemade cookies when I first moved in, suddenly wouldn't make eye contact when she saw me checking my mail. The postal carrier started leaving packages at the end of my driveway instead of bringing them to the house, claiming there had been complaints about aggressive dogs, despite the fact that Sherlock and Watson were the friendliest animals in the county. When I tried to engage neighbors in casual conversation, they would politely excuse themselves and hurry away, as if association with me might somehow contaminate them with whatever property violations I was supposedly guilty of. Janine's strategy was working. She was using manufactured authority and social pressure to make me feel like a pariah in my own neighborhood. The breakthrough in her harassment campaign came when I discovered that she had filed a complaint with my podcast hosting platform, claiming that I was using my show to coordinate harassment campaigns against community officials. The complaint was accompanied by dozens of fake social media accounts, posting negative reviews, and reporting my content as promoting antisocial behavior. Within 24 hours, my latest episode had been flagged for review and temporarily removed from the platform pending investigation. Watching months of work disappear because of one woman's fake authority claims was devastating, but it also crystallized something important. Janine wasn't just harassing me locally anymore. She was actively trying to destroy my livelihood and professional reputation through coordinated digital attacks. That evening, I made a decision that would change the entire dynamic of our conflict. Instead of continuing to defend myself against her attacks, I was going to go on the offensive, using the tools I knew best: investigation, documentation, and public exposure. I spent the night researching Janine's background through public records, social media archives, and property databases. What I discovered was both illuminating and terrifying. Janine Cartwright had been fired from 3 different jobs over the past 5 years, each time following complaints about exceeding authority and harassment of clients. She had attempted to run for various HOA positions in multiple communities, losing each election by embarrassing margins, but continuing to act as if she held the positions anyway. Most disturbing of all, I found evidence that she had been targeting isolated homeowners across 4 different counties, using the same fake authority tactics to pressure people into selling their properties at below-market prices. I decided to fight back using the platform she had tried to destroy. I created a special episode of my podcast titled Fake Authority, a real-time case study in harassment, and used Janine's campaign against me as an example of how predators use manufactured authority to intimidate victims. The episode featured audio recordings of her trespassing incidents, photographs of her fake credentials, and a detailed timeline of her escalating harassment tactics. But more importantly, I reached out to other victims I had identified through public records and invited them to share their stories. The response was overwhelming. Within 48 hours, I had interviews with 12 different homeowners who had been targeted by Janine's fake authority scams, and each story followed the same terrifying pattern of escalation, from minor harassment to life-destroying campaigns of intimidation. The episode exploded across social media, garnering hundreds of thousands of downloads and thousands of comments from people sharing their own experiences with fake authority figures and organized harassment campaigns. But the real breakthrough came when Mildred Harper, a 71-year-old retired real estate attorney who lived down the road, reached out with information that would transform my understanding of what I was really fighting. Millie had been conducting her own investigation into Janine's activities and had uncovered evidence of a sophisticated criminal network that used fake authority harassment to force property sales for profit. What you're dealing with isn't just one disturbed individual, Millie explained during our meeting at a local coffee shop. This is organized crime, and you've accidentally become the target of a multi-million-dollar property theft operation. Armed with this new understanding, I realized that my peaceful ranch in Hollow Creek had become ground zero for something much larger and more dangerous than neighborhood harassment. Janine wasn't just a lonely busybody with delusions of authority. She was part of a criminal enterprise that had successfully stolen dozens of properties from vulnerable homeowners across multiple states. The fake violation notices and midnight surveillance weren't random acts of harassment. They were calculated steps in a proven system designed to make homeownership so miserable that victims would sell just to escape the constant pressure. The woman who had been measuring my property in the darkness wasn't just threatening my peace of mind anymore. She was threatening my home, my livelihood, and potentially my life. The war was about to escalate to levels that neither of us could have predicted. Janine's response to my viral podcast was swift, calculated, and more dangerous than anything she had attempted before. Instead of backing down when exposed, she doubled down by escalating to outright fraud and physical intimidation. 3 days after my episode went live, she appeared at my front gate at dawn with what appeared to be an official city inspection team. She wore a crisp uniform shirt with an embroidered badge, carried official-looking documents in a leather portfolio, and was accompanied by 2 men in hard hats who introduced themselves as building safety inspectors Martinez and Thompson. The performance was more sophisticated than her previous amateur attempts at authority, suggesting that she had either received professional training or was working with people who knew how to impersonate government officials convincingly. Mr. Cole, we're here to conduct an emergency safety inspection based on multiple complaints filed with the city regarding unsafe structures on this property, Janine announced in a voice that carried new confidence and authority. State law requires immediate compliance with inspection protocols, and interference with official duties is a criminal offense. She handed me a document that looked genuinely official. Professional letterhead, official seals, legal language that seemed legitimate until you read it carefully enough to notice that it cited non-existent statutes and referenced agencies that didn't exist. The fake inspectors nodded seriously and began unpacking equipment that looked convincingly professional, measuring devices, clipboards, even what appeared to be official city vehicles parked outside my gate. The entire performance was designed to overwhelm resistance through apparent legitimacy and implied legal consequences for non-compliance. But I had learned from our previous encounters, and this time I was ready. I began recording the entire interaction on my phone while asking pointed questions about their authority and documentation. Officers, I appreciate your concern for safety, but I'd like to verify this inspection order before allowing access to my property. Could you provide the case number and the name of the supervising official who authorized this inspection? Janine's confident facade began to crack as I pressed for specific details about jurisdiction, legal authority, and procedural requirements. The fake inspectors started looking nervous and kept glancing at Janine for cues, revealing that they were following her script rather than operating under genuine authority. When I called the city hall on speakerphone to verify the inspection order, the clerk's response was immediate and devastating. "Sir, we have no record of any inspection orders for your property, and the individuals you've described are not city employees." The moment of exposure triggered something in Janine that went beyond embarrassment or frustration into genuine psychological breakdown. Instead of retreating when her deception was revealed, she became increasingly agitated and began making threats that crossed the line from harassment into genuine intimidation. "You people think you can hide behind technicalities and bureaucratic corruption?" she screamed, her carefully constructed official persona dissolving into the manic energy I had witnessed during her midnight property invasion. "This property is a danger to the community, and I have the authority to enforce compliance whether you cooperate or not." The fake inspectors began backing toward their vehicles, apparently realizing that the situation was spiraling beyond their comfort level. But Janine continued her rant while advancing toward my fence line with increasing aggression. What happened next transformed our conflict from harassment into something that required immediate law enforcement intervention. Janine began vandalizing my property in broad daylight while screaming about enforcement authority and community standards. She spray-painted condiment across my mailbox, tore down sections of my fence, and used bolt cutters to damage the lock on my front gate. The destruction wasn't random violence. It was systematic sabotage, designed to create the appearance of legitimate enforcement action. As she worked, she kept up a running commentary about my violations and her authority to remedy them, apparently believing that narrating her crimes somehow legitimized them. The fake inspectors fled the scene as soon as the vandalism began, leaving Janine alone to complete her enforcement action, while I recorded everything and called 911. The real city building inspector arrived just as Janine was attempting to spray paint violation codes on my barn, accompanied by sheriff's deputies who had been dispatched in response to reports of vandalism and impersonation of government officials. Inspector Rodriguez was a soft-spoken professional who had been doing his job for over 20 years, and he was visibly disturbed by what he found. After examining Janine's fake credentials and documents, he confirmed that not only did she have no authority to conduct inspections, but that she had created an elaborate criminal enterprise based on impersonating city officials. "Ma'am, what you've done here constitutes multiple felonies under state and federal law," he explained while deputies documented the vandalism and collected evidence. "Impersonating government officials, creating fraudulent documents, and destruction of property are serious crimes that carry significant prison sentences." But Janine's response to being caught red-handed revealed the depth of her delusion and the danger she represented to anyone who challenged her authority. Instead of showing remorse or attempting to negotiate, she launched into a tirade about corruption and conspiracy that made it clear she genuinely believed her own lies about having legitimate authority. This is exactly the kind of bureaucratic protection that allows property owners to ignore community standards, she screamed at Inspector Rodriguez while covered in spray paint and surrounded by the evidence of her crimes. "I have documentation proving my authority, and I demand that you complete the condemnation process I've initiated." Even as she was being handcuffed and arrested for multiple felonies, she continued insisting that the real crime was the conspiracy to protect my non-compliant property from legitimate enforcement action. That afternoon, as crime scene technicians photographed the vandalism and collected evidence from Janine's fake inspection kit, I realized that we had crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. The woman who had started with measuring tapes and clipboard authority had escalated to organized fraud, property destruction, and criminal impersonation of government officials. The charges she was facing, fraud, impersonation, vandalism, and criminal trespass, carried potential prison sentences that would remove her from the community for years. But somehow, standing among the wreckage of my fence and looking at the spray-painted violations covering my mailbox, I didn't feel victorious. Janine's final threat as she was loaded into the patrol car echoed in my mind. "This is just the beginning. You people have no idea what real enforcement looks like." The woman who had declared war on my peaceful ranch had just lost a major battle, but something in her voice suggested that she viewed this setback as motivation for escalation rather than a reason to surrender. The arrest of Janine Cartwright for felony fraud and vandalism should have been the end of our conflict, But her release on bail after just 18 hours in custody proved that she viewed legal consequences as temporary obstacles rather than deterrents to her mission. Within 48 hours of her release, I began receiving anonymous phone calls at all hours. My internet service was mysteriously interrupted multiple times, and someone had been leaving dead animals on my property during the night. The harassment had evolved from fake authority intimidation to genuine stalking behavior that suggested Janine's psychological break was complete and irreversible. Control. She was no longer pretending to enforce community standards. She was waging psychological warfare against someone who had dared to challenge her delusions of power. The breakthrough in fighting back came when Millie Harper provided me with contact information for other victims of Janine's harassment campaigns across multiple counties. Instead of suffering in isolation, I decided to organize a coordinated response that would expose the full scope of her criminal enterprise and provide mutual support for everyone she had targeted. I scheduled a special live stream episode of my podcast titled Fake Authority Exposed, Victims Fight Back, and invited 12 other homeowners who had been targeted by Janine's schemes to share their stories in real time. The goal was to create an undeniable record of her pattern of criminal behavior, while building a community of survivors who could support each other through the legal process and recovery. The livestream was scheduled for 7 p.m. on a Thursday evening, with participants joining from across Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico to tell their stories of harassment, intimidation, and property theft attempts. As we went live, with over 2,000 viewers watching, the sense of solidarity among victims was immediate and powerful. Eleanor Martinez from San Antonio described how Janine had targeted her elderly mother with fake HOA violations until she sold her family home for half its market value. James Patterson from Tulsa explained how fake building inspections had forced him to spend thousands of dollars on unnecessary repairs before he discovered that the inspectors were fraudulent. Each story followed the same pattern: isolated homeowners targeted with fake authority, escalating harassment campaigns, and either successful property theft or victims who fought back and faced retaliation. 30 minutes into the live stream, with viewers flooding the chat with support for the victims and outrage at Janine's crimes, we were interrupted by loud banging on my front door and the sound of someone screaming about illegal broadcasting and defamation. The security cameras showed Janine had arrived with what appeared to be official documents and was demanding entry to shut down the unauthorized broadcast facility. She was clearly watching the live stream and had decided to disrupt it in real time, apparently believing that she could claim authority over internet broadcasting the same way she had tried to control property standards. The timing was perfect. From an evidence standpoint, thousands of viewers were witnessing her harassment behavior in real time, creating an indisputable record of her ongoing criminal conduct. I made the decision to continue broadcasting while Janine escalated her disruption attempts outside. The viewers could hear her screaming about broadcast licenses and community standards while she pounded on my door and windows. "This is exactly what we've all been dealing with," I explained to the live stream audience while Janine's voice provided a real-time soundtrack of unhinged authority claims. She believes she has the right to control every aspect of our lives, from our property maintenance to our professional activities. The other victims on the call began sharing similar stories of how Janine had tried to interfere with their work, their family activities, and their basic rights as homeowners. The pattern was clear. She didn't just want to harass property owners, she wanted to control every aspect of their lives through manufactured authority claims. The situation escalated dramatically when Janine apparently decided that disruption wasn't enough and began attempting to break into my property during the live broadcast. The security cameras showed her using tools to damage my front gate while screaming about enforcement authority and illegal broadcast operations. She had brought spray paint and was attempting to vandalize my house while 2,000 viewers watched in real time. The other victims on the call were providing running commentary about her behavior, creating a kind of real-time criminal analysis that was both educational and deeply disturbing. "She's completely lost touch with reality," observed Dr. Patricia Williams, a retired psychology professor from Austin who had been targeted by Janine's schemes. "This isn't harassment anymore. This is a complete psychological breakdown being broadcast to thousands of witnesses." Sheriff's deputies arrived just as Janine was attempting to spray paint illegal broadcast facility across my front door, with the entire incident being witnessed by thousands of live stream viewers and recorded by multiple security cameras. Her arrest was captured in high definition from multiple angles, creating irrefutable evidence of stalking, property destruction, and violation of her bail conditions. As she was being handcuffed for the second time in less than a week, she continued screaming about broadcast licenses and community standards, apparently believing that her authority extended to regulating internet content and podcast production. The deputies later told me that in 20 years of law enforcement, they had never arrested someone who seemed so completely convinced of their own fictional authority while simultaneously committing obvious crime. The livestream concluded with all 12 victims agreeing to coordinate their legal cases and support each other through the prosecution process. The real-time documentation of Janine's harassment behavior had created evidence that would be impossible for any defense attorney to explain away, and the community of victims had become a mutual support network that would help everyone heal from the trauma of her campaign. But more importantly, the broadcast had reached thousands of viewers who were now educated about fake authority scams and equipped to recognize similar criminal behavior in their own communities. The woman who had tried to isolate and intimidate individual homeowners had accidentally created a powerful coalition of victims and witnesses who would ensure that her crimes were fully exposed and prosecuted. The war she had declared on my peaceful ranch had become a community-wide effort to protect vulnerable homeowners from organized harassment and fraud, and she was about to discover that fake authority was no match for real justice, backed by thousands of witnesses and victims who refused to suffer in silence anymore. The aftermath of my livestream victory should have marked the end of Janine's harassment campaign, but her bail release after the broadcast incident proved that legal consequences only fueled her desperation. Instead of accepting defeat, she had escalated to round-the-clock surveillance of my property, installing unauthorized cameras on utility poles, and even hiding recording devices in my mailbox. The privacy invasion was so blatant that neighbors began calling to report suspicious activity. But Janine had convinced herself that documenting my violations was her civic duty. When I discovered the hidden cameras during my morning property check, I realized that her obsession had crossed into genuine stalking behavior that posed a real threat to my safety and sanity. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when I was recording a podcast episode about financial fraud schemes. The sound of metal meeting wood shook the entire building so violently that books fell off my shelves and my border collies erupted into panic barking. My first thought was that a tree had fallen during the recent windstorm, but looking through the studio window revealed something that made my heart stop. A silver Toyota Camry was backing away from the completely obliterated remains of my chicken coop. Splintered wood, twisted wire mesh, and scattered feathers filled the air like apocalyptic snow. And behind the wheel, visible through a spider-webbed windshield, was Janine Cartwright, laughing with the manic joy of someone who had finally found the perfect expression of her authority delusions. The chicken coop, which had housed 6 happy hens and had been part of the property since the 1930s, was completely destroyed. What had been a charming piece of agricultural history moments before was now debris scattered across 50 feet of my front yard. The impact had been so violent that parts of the structure were embedded in the ground while other pieces were still falling like wood in rain. But Janine wasn't finished with her enforcement action. As I watched in horror, she shifted the Camry into drive and began accelerating toward my barn, the same historic structure she had spray-painted fake violation codes on during her previous criminal episodes. The engine screamed as she floored the accelerator, and I realized, with crystal clarity, that she intended to destroy the barn the same way she had demolished the chicken coop. I sprinted outside while dialing 911, shouting into the phone about a woman using her car as a battering ram against my buildings. The emergency operator was asking for details when Janine's Camry slammed into the barn wall with a crash that seemed to shake the entire county. The impact was devastating. The front of the car crumpled like aluminum foil, the windshield exploded into fragments, and steam poured from the destroyed radiator. But impossibly, Janine climbed out of the wreckage, still clutching her clipboard, blood streaming down her face from windshield cuts, smiling with horror movie satisfaction, while screaming, "Violation enforced! Property owner has been served notice of escalated compliance measures." The sight of neighbors arriving before emergency responders, drawn by the crashes and smoke, created a surreal scene of community shock and disbelief. Mildred Harper appeared with a baseball bat, immediately understanding what had happened, and announcing to the growing crowd, "That woman just committed vehicular assault. Someone called the district attorney's office. This is attempted murder." Other neighbors pulled out phones and began recording, creating a semicircle around Janine as she continued her bizarre post-crash ritual of taping violation notices to debris from her own destroyed car. The woman, covered in blood and automotive fluids, surrounded by wreckage while methodically completing paperwork as if nothing unusual had happened, created horrified fascination among witnesses who couldn't believe what they were seeing. When Sheriff Dalton arrived with paramedics and firefighters, Janine was still conscious, but clearly in shock, continuing to insist she had been conducting legitimate enforcement actions, even as medics treated her injuries. "Officer, I need you to witness the completion of violation enforcement procedures," she told the deputy while blood streamed from her forehead. "The property owner has been served appropriate notice, and the non-compliant structures have been remediated according to community standards." Deputy Dalton looked around at the destruction, my obliterated chicken coop, my barn with a car-sized hole, and Janine's Toyota looking like demolition derby wreckage, and shook his head in amazement. "Ma'am, you just committed vehicular assault and destruction of property. This is way beyond harassment now." The evidence of premeditation was overwhelming and immediately obvious to investigating officers. Janine's car contained detailed property maps with attack routes marked in red ink, photographs of my buildings from multiple angles, and handwritten notes about enforcement timing and optimal impact points. Her phone's GPS history revealed practice runs past my property for over a week, testing different approach speeds and angles. This wasn't spontaneous revenge. It was carefully planned assault that had been rehearsed and refined through multiple sessions. The discovery of these planning materials transformed charges from simple vandalism to felony assault with a deadly weapon, destruction of property, and potentially attempted murder, depending on whether prosecutors could prove intent to harm me personally rather than just destroy buildings. As paramedics loaded Janine into an ambulance while she continued protesting about legitimate community standards enforcement, I stood among the wreckage of what had been a peaceful ranch property 30 minutes earlier. The chicken coop that had housed generations of poultry was completely gone, existing now only as scattered debris and traumatized birds wandering in confusion. My historic barn, which had survived nearly a century of Texas weather and economic changes, now had a gaping hole where Janine's car had punched through the wall. But looking at the destruction, I felt more relief than anger. The escalation had finally reached a level where law enforcement would have to take serious action, and the evidence was so overwhelming that even Janine's delusions couldn't explain it away. The woman who had started with measuring tapes had just used a 2-ton vehicle as a weapon, and there would be consequences that even her fake authority couldn't circumvent. The vehicular assault investigation brought federal attention that transformed my quiet ranch into a major crime scene. Within hours, my property was swarming with investigators from the Sheriff's Department, District Attorney's Office, and FBI agents who had been called in because Janine's activities appeared to cross state lines and involve federal crimes related to mail fraud and organized harassment. Deputy Dalton, who had initially treated Janine as a nuisance complaint, was now leading a multi-jurisdictional task force investigating what prosecutors called the most extensive property harassment scheme in Texas history. The scope expanded rapidly as authorities realized they weren't dealing with isolated neighbor harassment, but rather a sophisticated criminal operation targeting homeowners across multiple counties for several years. Digital evidence from Janine's phone and computer revealed the true scope of her operation and systematic targeting process. GPS data showed surveillance patterns covering 12 properties across 4 counties, with detailed logs of homeowner schedules, family situations, and perceived vulnerability. She had been collecting intelligence on potential targets for months before beginning harassment campaigns, using social media research, public records searches, and physical surveillance to identify isolated homeowners susceptible to pressure tactics. The most disturbing discovery was financial records showing payments from shell companies totaling over $200,000 over 3 years, suggesting her harassment activities weren't delusional individual actions, but profitable criminal enterprise components. The connection to organized property fraud became clear when investigators traced shell company payments to a network of real estate investors specializing in acquiring distressed properties at below-market prices. The scheme was elegant and devastating. Identify homeowners motivated to sell quickly, launch systematic harassment campaigns making their lives miserable, then swoop in with cash offers that seemed like escape routes from constant pressure. Janine's role was creating pressure through fake authority harassment, property vandalism, and escalating intimidation tactics that left victims desperate for relief. Investors would purchase properties for 30 to 40% below market value, make minimal improvements, and resell at full market prices within 6 months. Investigators found evidence the scheme had successfully forced over 60 families from homes across Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico, generating millions in profits for the criminal network. Many victims were elderly homeowners, recent widows, or people going through difficult transitions, who were particularly vulnerable to authority intimidation and sustained harassment. The psychological impact was devastating. Several victims required therapy for anxiety and depression. Others were forced to relocate far from family and support networks, and at least 3 cases involved victims who suffered heart attacks during harassment campaigns. What seemed like one unhinged individual's actions turned out to be calculated criminal enterprise that destroyed dozens of lives for financial gain. A federal investigation revealed Janine's psychological profile was more complex than simple delusion or mental illness. FBI behavioral analysts determined that while she genuinely believed in her authority to enforce community standards, she was also fully aware her harassment campaigns served profitable criminal purposes. She had been recruited by the Property Investment Network specifically because of her obsessive personality and ability to maintain sustained pressure on targets without showing obvious financial motivation. Her clipboard, fake credentials, and bureaucratic language weren't just mental illness manifestations. They were carefully crafted tools designed to intimidate people who might resist obvious criminal threats, but would comply with perceived authority figures. The revelation about Janine's criminal connections explained why she had escalated to vehicular assault when faced with legal consequences. The Property Investment Network had apparently promised protection from prosecution in exchange for maintaining pressure on high-value targets. And when that protection failed to materialize, she panicked and resorted to increasingly desperate measures. Wiretapped phone conversations revealed she had been promised a $50,000 bonus for forcing me to sell my ranch, considered a particularly valuable target because of its size, location, and development potential. The vehicular assault had been her final attempt to complete the contract and collect bonus payment, even after legal pressure and harassment proved ineffective against my resistance and public exposure efforts. As investigation expanded, other victims began coming forward with harassment and intimidation stories. The pattern was remarkably consistent: fake authority figures making impossible demands, escalating pressure tactics when victims resisted, and ultimately either successful property acquisition or harassers moving to easier targets. Many victims never reported harassment because they believed they were dealing with legitimate authority figures, or because psychological pressure was so effective they blamed themselves for problems. Discovering their experiences were part of organized criminal enterprise rather than random bad luck was both validating and infuriating for people who had suffered in silence for months or years. Media attention surrounding the case brought national focus to fake authority harassment and property crime schemes targeting homeowners. My podcast about the experience, titled The Enforcement Files: How Fake Authority Nearly Cost Me Everything, became one of the year's most downloaded true crime episodes and sparked conversations about protecting vulnerable homeowners from similar schemes. Law enforcement agencies nationwide began reviewing unsolved harassment cases to identify potential connections to organized property fraud, and several states introduced legislation strengthening penalties for impersonating authority figures and harassing property owners. The woman who started by measuring my property with tape measures had inadvertently exposed a criminal network operating with impunity for years, and legal consequences were about to be far more severe than anyone involved had anticipated. The trial of Janine Cartwright and her co-conspirators became one of Texas' most closely watched criminal cases that year, drawing national media attention and serving as landmark prosecution for property harassment crimes. Evidence against Janine was overwhelming. Dozens of hours of high-definition security footage showing harassment activities, GPS data documenting months of surveillance and planning, financial records proving connection to property investment schemes, and testimony from over 20 victims who had suffered under her fake authority intimidation campaigns. What made the trial remarkable was Janine's decision to represent herself, apparently still believing her actions had been legitimate community standards enforcement rather than serious crimes that destroyed dozens of lives across multiple states. Courtroom scenes were surreal, with Janine cross-examining her own victims while maintaining she had performed necessary community services. When Mrs. Eleanor Watson, an 82-year-old widow forced to sell her family home after months of harassment, testified about the psychological toll of Janine's campaign, Janine's response was lecturing her about property maintenance standards and community responsibility. "Ma'am, I understand enforcement actions can be stressful," she told the sobbing elderly woman, "but maintaining property values requires consistent application of community standards." The judge threatened contempt charges multiple times as Janine continued treating proceedings as if defending legitimate authority rather than answering for criminal harassment and fraud. My testimony took the better part of a day. walking the jury through escalation from midnight property measuring to vehicular assault while security footage played on courtroom monitors. The progression was so clearly documented and evidence so overwhelming that even Janine's self-presentation couldn't create reasonable doubt about her guilt. But the moment that seemed to impact the jury most deeply was when prosecutors played audio recording of her post-crash statement to paramedics. Violation enforced. Property owner has been served notice of escalated compliance measures. The combination of her cheerful tone and context of having crashed her car into my barn while covered in blood created a chilling portrait of someone completely detached from reality and consequences of her actions. The prosecution's case was strengthened by testimony from FBI behavioral analysts who explained how Janine's psychological profile had been exploited by the property investment network. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a forensic psychologist who had evaluated Janine, testified that while she suffered from narcissistic personality disorder and delusions of authority, she was fully competent to understand her actions were illegal and harmful to others. The defendant's mental health issues may explain her behavior, but they don't excuse it, Dr. Martinez explained. She was recruited specifically because her psychological makeup made her an effective intimidator who could maintain pressure on victims while appearing to act from legitimate authority rather than criminal intent. The trial's most dramatic moment came when lead investigator from the Property Investment Network, Marcus Webb, who had agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentence, testified about recruiting and managing Janine's harassment activities. Webb described how the network had identified Janine as ideal pressure agent because of her obsessive personality and genuine belief in her authority to enforce community standards. She wasn't just pretending to be an authority figure, Webb explained. She really believed she had that authority, which made her incredibly effective at intimidating people who might have seen through a normal con artist. The revelation that Janine's delusions had been weaponized for profit added another tragedy layer to an already devastating case. The jury deliberated less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: vehicular assault, organized fraud, harassment, property destruction, and racketeering. Judge Patricia Reynolds, who had presided over the trial with remarkable patience despite Janine's disruptive behavior, delivered a sentence reflecting both crime severity and scope of their impact. Mr. Cartwright, your actions have caused immeasurable harm to dozens of families and communities, she said. While your mental health issues may have contributed to your behavior, you made conscious choices to participate in criminal enterprise that destroyed lives for profit. This court sentences you to 8 years in state prison, followed by 5 years supervised probation and restitution of $400,000 to your victims. But the most unexpected development came 18 months after Janine began serving her sentence, when I received a handwritten letter that completely changed my perspective on the entire ordeal. The letter was part of a restorative justice program that allowed offenders to communicate with victims under supervised conditions, and Janine's words revealed transformation that seemed almost impossible given her trial behavior. Mr. Cole, she wrote, I know nothing I can say will undo harm I caused you and other families who suffered because of my actions. Therapy I've received in prison has helped me understand that my need to control others came from feeling powerless in my own life, and that I chose to hurt innocent people rather than deal with my own problems. I was sick, but that doesn't excuse what I did. The letter led to supervised prison meeting as part of restorative justice process, where I came face to face with a very different version of Janine Cartwright than the woman who had crashed her car into my barn. The transformation was remarkable. She spoke quietly and thoughtfully, taking full responsibility for her actions without grandiose language about community standards and enforcement authority that had characterized her previous communications. I understand now that I was never trying to help communities, she said during our conversation. I was trying to feel powerful and important, and I chose the cruelest possible way to do it. The people who paid me knew exactly how to use my sickness for their profit, and I let them, because it gave me the authority I craved. Today, my ranch in Hollow Creek is peaceful again, with happy chickens in their fortress-like coop and renovated barns serving as both podcast studio and meeting place for harassment survivors. The property has become a local landmark, the place where fake authority died, as one neighbor put it, and property values have actually increased since the HOA free zone was officially established. My podcast series about the experience became required listening at police academies and victim advocacy programs, helping educate law enforcement and potential victims about these crime types. Sometimes justice isn't just about punishment, it's about stopping someone from destroying themselves and others, creating something positive from the wreckage of what came before.